When you pull a crisp dollar bill out of your wallet today, you expect to see a president looking back at you. We are entirely accustomed to the faces of Washington, Lincoln, and Jackson serving as the ultimate symbols of American financial backing. But the very first face to ever appear on a federally issued greenback did not belong to a president at all. It belonged to a man who put it there himself. Salmon P. Chase was Abraham Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, a man of towering intellect, relentless ambition, and staggering ego. He was tasked with an impossible job, inventing a modern national monetary system from scratch to fund the bloodiest war in American history. And when the time came to design the new national currency that would hold the fracturing country together, Chase decided his own portrait was the most reassuring symbol of federal authority. How did a man whose name most Americans have forgotten manage to permanently alter the way we buy, sell, borrow, and save? And what happens when the architect of a nation's financial survival is simultaneously plotting to steal the presidency from the very man who appointed him? To understand the audacity of the greenback, you have to understand the deeply ingrained ambition of the man who created it. Salmon Portland Chase was born in New Hampshire in 1808. His early life was defined by sudden loss and a rigid, unforgiving standard of duty. When Chase was just 9 years old, his father died, leaving the family in severe financial distress. His mother sent him away to Ohio to live with his uncle, Philander Chase, who was the Episcopal Bishop of Ohio. Bishop Chase was a severe frontier clergyman who believed in strict discipline, grueling farm labor, and intense classical education. Under his uncle's iron-fisted guardianship, young Salmon learned Greek and Latin, but he also internalized a deep, unshakable self-righteousness. He was taught that he was meant for greatness, but that greatness required moral purity and absolute control. Chase eventually attended Dartmouth College, where he excelled academically, projecting an air of aristocratic superiority that often alienated his peers. After graduation, he moved to Washington, D.C., where he studied law under William Wirt, the former Attorney General of the United States. This apprenticeship was Chase's first real taste of federal power. He walked the same dirt streets as the political titans of the era, observing how laws were made, how arguments were framed, and how power was wielded in the Capitol. But Chase knew he lacked the family wealth to launch a political career in the East. He needed a place where a young, ambitious lawyer could make a name for himself rapidly. He chose Cincinnati, Ohio. In the 1830s, Cincinnati was a booming frontier metropolis, situated directly on the border between the Free State of Ohio and the slave state of Kentucky. The Ohio River was the only physical barrier separating two fundamentally incompatible economic and moral systems. For a lawyer looking to make an impact, it was a powder keg. Chase quickly established a successful commercial law practice, dealing with the complex, mundane financial disputes of riverboat merchants and land speculators. He learned exactly how disorganized the American banking system was. At the time, there was no national currency. Banks issued their own paper notes, whose value fluctuated wildly depending on the bank's reputation and distance. It was a chaotic, decentralized system that Chase found deeply inefficient. But it was the moral crisis across the river that forged his political identity. Chase witnessed the brutality of slavery and the aggressive attempts by Southern slaveholders to reclaim escaped slaves who had crossed into Ohio. He began taking on cases defending fugitive slaves and the abolitionists who helped them. He did not argue these cases purely on emotional or humanitarian grounds. He used surgical, constitutional logic. Chase developed the legal theory that the federal government had no constitutional authority to establish or protect slavery anywhere outside the specific states where it already existed. He argued that the Constitution was fundamentally an anti-slavery document, a radical position at the time. His relentless, high-profile defenses in the courtroom earned him the nickname, the Attorney General for Fugitive Slaves. This legal crusade propelled Chase into politics. He realized that the courtroom was not enough. The laws themselves had to be changed. He became a master political operator, helping to organize the Liberty Party and later the Free Soil Party, uniting disparate factions under the powerful slogan of free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. He argued that a secretive slave power conspiracy was actively trying to take over the federal government and destroy the economic opportunities of free white laborers in the North. This economic framing of the anti-slavery argument broadened his appeal massively. By 1849, through a series of shrewd and somewhat ruthless political bargains in the state legislature, Chase secured a seat in the United States Senate. In Washington, Chase stood as a fiercely independent, uncompromising voice against the expansion of slavery. He was handsome, imposing, and carried himself with a solemn dignity that bordered on arrogance. He firmly believed he was the smartest man in any room and the most morally pure politician in the nation. When the Republican Party formed in the 1850s as a coalition to stop the spread of slavery, Chase was one of its founding architects. He left the Senate to become the governor of Ohio, proving he could hold executive office and manage a large state's economy. By 1860, Salmon P. Chase was convinced that it was his destiny to become the President of the United States. He went to the Republican National Convention in Chicago, expecting to be crowned the nominee. He had the resume, the intellect, and the long record of anti-slavery leadership. Instead, he was outmaneuvered. The convention bypassed the polarizing Chase and chose a moderate, relatively unknown prairie lawyer from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Chase was devastated and deeply embittered. He viewed Lincoln as an intellectual inferior, an unpolished country politician who had unjustly stolen the prize that rightfully belonged to him. But Lincoln was a master of political strategy. Knowing he faced an unprecedented national crisis as the southern states began to secede, Lincoln decided to build a cabinet composed of his fiercest political rivals, men who had vast influence and administrative capability. He needed the radical, anti-slavery wing of the party on his side, and he needed a man with a brilliant legal and organizational mind to handle the impending financial catastrophe. In March of 1861, Lincoln offered Salmon P. Chase the position of Secretary of the Treasury. Chase accepted, stepping into an executive department that was completely unprepared for what was about to happen. The national debt was rising, the Treasury was practically empty, the decentralized banking system was completely incapable of financing a massive military mobilization, and the nation was hurtling towards civil war. Chase was about to be handed the power to completely rewrite the financial architecture of the United States, and he intended to use every ounce of that power to ensure the Union survived and to ensure that everyone knew exactly who had saved it. When Salmon P. Chase walked into the Treasury building in Washington in March of 1861, he inherited an institution on the brink of total collapse. The outgoing Buchanan administration had been riddled with Southern sympathizers who had systematically weakened the federal government's financial standing. The national debt hovered around $76 million, a staggering sum for the era. The government's primary source of revenue, customs duties collected at ports, was plummeting as the secession crisis paralyzed maritime trade. When Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in April, igniting the Civil War, Chase faced a brutal mathematical reality. Abraham Lincoln was calling for 75,000 troops, an army that would require uniforms, rifles, rations, and transport. The Treasury contained less than $2 million in operational funds. Chase's initial instinct was to rely on the established, traditional incentives of American finance. At the time, the federal government operated strictly on a specie basis. It only recognized and paid out gold and silver coin. There was no standardized national paper currency. Instead, thousands of state-chartered banks issued their own localized paper notes, which fluctuated wildly in value. To fund the early months of the war, Chase traveled to New York, Boston, and Philadelphia to negotiate massive loans directly from syndicates of private bankers. He convinced them to lend the government millions of dollars in gold, promising to pay them back with interest using the proceeds of government bond sales. For a few months, this fragile alliance held the Union war machine together, but the scale of the conflict rapidly outpaced the capacity of private gold reserves. By December of 1861, the war was going poorly for the North, and the British Empire was threatening to intervene on behalf of the Confederacy following a diplomatic crisis. Panic swept through the financial markets. Citizens began hoarding gold. The New York banks, realizing they were bleeding their reserves dry to fund a war with no end in sight, abruptly suspended specie payments. They refused to convert paper banknotes into gold. Days later, the federal government was forced to do the same. The Union was functionally bankrupt. Contractors stopped delivering supplies. Soldiers in the field went unpaid for months. The entire war effort was grinding to a halt because the physical mechanism of paying for it had shattered. Chase was cornered. He was fundamentally a hard money conservative who believed that paper money not backed by gold was economically dangerous and constitutionally dubious. But the survival of the United States was at stake. In the House of Representatives, a New York congressman named Elbridge Gerry Spalding drafted a radical, unprecedented piece of legislation. It proposed that the federal government simply print its own paper money, unbacked by gold or silver, and declare it valid for the payment of debts. Chase agonized over the decision, exchanging tense letters with bankers and politicians. Ultimately, sheer desperation forced his hand. He threw his immense political weight behind the bill, convincing reluctant members of Congress that it was the only alternative to national ruin. In February of 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act. This legislation fundamentally rewired the architecture of American wealth. It authorized the creation of $150 million in newly printed United States notes. But the true power of the act lay in two specific words printed on the back of every bill: legal tender. This was the core mechanical shift. The government was dictating by law that these new paper notes had to be accepted by any creditor for the payment of public and private debts. If a citizen owed a mortgage to a bank, the bank was legally required to accept this new federal paper as if it were gold. It was a massive exercise of federal power over the daily economic lives of citizens. Because the bills were printed on only one side with a distinctive, patented green ink to prevent photographic counterfeiting, the public quickly gave them a lasting nickname: greenbacks. With the legal framework established, Chase faced a completely different problem: public trust. Fiat currency only works if the population believes it has value. In an era before mass media, the physical design of the money was the government's most powerful tool for propaganda and reassurance. The Treasury Department's newly formed National Currency Bureau was tasked with designing these unprecedented federal bills. This is where Salmon P. Chase's towering ego merged with his executive authority. Decisions about the portraits on the new currency fell directly to the Treasury Secretary. Chase approved the image of Alexander Hamilton, the founding father of the Treasury, for the $2 bill. He placed Abraham Lincoln, the sitting president, on the $10 bill. But for the $1 bill, the lowest denomination and the note that would pass through the hands of the most ordinary citizens on a daily basis, Chase made a highly calculated decision. He instructed the engravers to use a portrait of himself. Chase justified this decision to his colleagues by claiming that the faces of living men provided better security against counterfeiting, as the public could more easily recognize their true features. But the political reality was far more transparent. Chase had never abandoned his belief that he, not Lincoln, should be the President of the United States. He was already quietly laying the groundwork for a primary challenge against Lincoln in the 1864 election. By placing his own face on the $1 greenback, Chase executed one of the most audacious political marketing campaigns in American history. Every time a Union soldier bought a newspaper, every time a factory worker purchased bread, they looked at the stern, authoritative face of Salmon P. Chase. He was literally branding the economic survival of the nation with his own image. However, printing money was only half the equation. Chase understood that if the government simply printed greenbacks endlessly, inflation would destroy the northern economy. To give the paper money actual value, the government had to create a mechanism to pull it back out of circulation. The greenback had to be necessary for something other than just private trade. The solution was taxation. In July of 1862, Congress passed the Revenue Act, heavily influenced by Chase's Treasury Department. This sweeping legislation introduced the first standardized, progressive income tax in American history. It also created an expansive system of excise taxes on almost every conceivable good and service: alcohol, tobacco, playing cards, legal documents, and manufactured goods. To enforce this massive new apparatus, the Act created the Office of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, the direct predecessor to the modern IRS. This was the mechanical genius of Chase's system. The federal government printed the greenbacks to pay the soldiers and the contractors. The soldiers and contractors spent the greenbacks in the economy. The new Internal Revenue Office then demanded that citizens pay their new, heavy taxes using those same greenbacks. By requiring taxes to be paid in federal currency, Chase created an artificial, legally mandated demand for the paper money he was printing. The greenback was no longer just a desperate wartime measure. It was the lifeblood of a sprawling, newly centralized federal state. And the man controlling the valve was Salmon P. Chase, whose face was circulating in millions of pockets, reminding a war-torn nation exactly who was paying the bills. While the greenbacks in the new Internal Revenue system kept the Union armies in the field, Chase recognized that this architecture was fundamentally unstable. The Legal Tender Act was a temporary wartime measure, an emergency bandage on a fractured financial system. The United States still lacked a unified, reliable banking infrastructure. The thousands of state-chartered banks continued to issue their own wildcat currency, competing with the federal greenbacks and causing endless confusion for merchants and citizens. Chase wanted total federal control over the money supply. He envisioned a system that would not only fund the war, but permanently bind the financial interests of the nation to the survival of the federal government. His solution was the National Banking Act, a piece of legislation that would fundamentally alter the relationship between banks and the state. Chase drafted the proposal and tirelessly lobbied Congress, facing immense resistance from powerful state banking interests in New York and New England, who saw their autonomy threatened. He argued that a unified national currency was as vital to the survival of the republic as a unified national army. After a bitter political struggle, Congress passed the act, and President Lincoln signed it into law in February of 1863. This legislation was a masterclass in institutional engineering. It allowed groups of private investors to obtain a federal charter to open a national bank. However, to receive this charter, the bank was required to purchase massive amounts of United States government bonds, the debt the government was issuing to fight the war. The bank then had to deposit these bonds with the Treasury Department in Washington. In exchange, the Treasury would issue the bank newly designed, standardized national banknotes, up to 90% of the value of the deposited bonds. The mechanics of this system were brilliantly coercive. By requiring banks to buy government debt to operate, Chase created a massive, guaranteed market for Union war bonds, ensuring a steady flow of capital to the military. Furthermore, the national banknotes were uniform in design across the entire country, ending the chaotic era of thousands of different local paper currencies. A note issued by a national bank in Ohio looked exactly the same as one issued in Massachusetts, backed by the same federal bonds and trusted equally by merchants. To ensure the supremacy of this new system, Chase later pushed for a punitive 10% tax on all state banknotes. This tax made it economically impossible for state banks to continue issuing their own currency, effectively forcing them to either join the federal system or stop printing money altogether. Through legislative force and taxation, Chase had engineered a near monopoly on the American money supply for the federal government. As his financial architecture took root, Chase's political ambitions intensified. By early 1864, the war was dragging into its fourth year with horrific casualties, and Lincoln's popularity was waning. Chase saw his opportunity. He utilized the vast patronage network of the Treasury Department, appointing thousands of customs collectors, tax assessors, and Treasury agents across the country who were loyal to him, not the president. He quietly orchestrated a campaign to challenge Lincoln for the Republican nomination. His supporters circulated a document known as the Pomeroy Circular, a scathing critique of Lincoln's leadership that explicitly endorsed Chase as the only man capable of saving the nation. The circular praised Chase's financial genius and his unyielding anti-slavery stance. But the political maneuver backfired disastrously. The circular was leaked to the press prematurely, exposing Chase's disloyalty and sparking outrage among Republican loyalists. Lincoln, demonstrating his superior political acumen, refused to fire Chase, keeping him trapped in the cabinet and forcing him to publicly disavow the very campaign he had orchestrated. The tension between the two men became unbearable. Chase, humiliated but still fiercely proud, adopted a strategy of petulant brinkmanship. Whenever Lincoln disagreed with him on a matter of patronage or policy, Chase would submit a formal letter of resignation, assuming Lincoln needed his financial expertise too much to actually let him go. This tactic worked 3 times. Lincoln, prioritizing the stability of the war effort, repeatedly smoothed things over and refused the resignations. But in June of 1864, Chase miscalculated. Following a minor dispute over the appointment of an assistant treasurer in New York, Chase submitted his resignation for the 4th time. He expected Lincoln to yield, as he always had. Instead, Lincoln, having just secured the Republican nomination for re-election, and weary of Chase's constant maneuvering, shocked Washington by accepting it. Lincoln wrote to Chase, stating plainly that they had reached a point of mutual embarrassment in their official relation, which it seems cannot be overcome or longer sustained. Chase was stunned. He had built the financial engine that was winning the war. He had placed his own face on the currency of the realm, and he genuinely believed he was indispensable. Now he was suddenly out of power, a political exile watching the climax of the Civil War from the sidelines. Yet Chase's exile was remarkably brief. In October of 1864, Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the author of the infamous Dred Scott decision, died. Lincoln, despite the bitter personal history, recognized Chase's brilliant legal mind and his unwavering commitment to the rights of newly freed slaves. In a move that demonstrated profound political grace and strategic foresight, Lincoln nominated his former rival to be the Chief Justice of the United States. Salmon P. Chase took the oath of office in December of 1864. He had traded the executive power of the Treasury for the ultimate judicial authority of the Supreme Court. It was from this high bench that Chase would be forced to confront the legal consequences of his own financial creations. The man who had stretched the Constitution to its breaking point to invent the greenback would now have to rule on whether his own actions had been legal in the first place. As Chief Justice, Salmon P. Chase presided over a Supreme Court navigating the chaotic legal wreckage of the Civil War and the volatile beginnings of Reconstruction. He was tasked with integrating millions of newly freed slaves into the constitutional framework of the nation. He oversaw the unprecedented impeachment trial of President Andrew Johnson in 1868, managing the deeply partisan spectacle with a strict adherence to legal procedure that infuriated radical Republicans. But the most profound test of his judicial tenure arrived when the legal foundation of his own financial architecture was challenged. The crisis centered on the greenbacks, The Legal Tender Act of 1862, which Chase had championed as Treasury Secretary, had forced creditors to accept unbacked federal paper money for debts that had originally been contracted in gold. Following the war, creditors began suing, arguing that the federal government had no constitutional authority to print fiat currency and mandate its acceptance. They claimed the Legal Tender Act was an unconstitutional violation of contracts and an illegal seizure of property. The issue finally reached the Supreme Court in 1869 in a case known as Hepburn versus Griswold. This was the moment of ultimate irony for Chase. As Treasury Secretary, he had argued that extreme military necessity justified the creation of the greenback. Now, as Chief Justice, sitting in a nation at peace, he had to interpret the strict text of the Constitution. In a stunning reversal, Chase authored the majority opinion, striking down the very law he had created. In a 4-3 decision, the court ruled that the Legal Tender Act was unconstitutional when applied to debts contracted before the law was passed. Chase, reverting to his deep-seated hard money principles, argued that the Constitution gave Congress the power to coin money, but not to print unbacked paper and force citizens to accept it. He explicitly acknowledged his own past actions, writing that he had erred as Treasury Secretary under the immense pressure of the war, but that the court must now uphold the true meaning of the Constitution. It was an astonishing admission, a rare moment of a towering historical figure publicly repudiating his own legacy. But Chase's victory was short-lived. The decision sent shockwaves through the financial markets. The entire post-war economy was built on the circulation of greenbacks. Invalidating them threatened to plunge the nation into an immediate depression. President Ulysses S. Grant, whose administration relied on the stability of the greenback system, moved swiftly. On the very day the Hepburn decision was announced, Grant nominated 2 new justices to the Supreme Court to fill existing vacancies. Justices he knew believed in the constitutionality of paper money. The following year, the newly reconfigured court agreed to hear 2 more cases regarding the greenbacks, known as the legal tender cases. In 1871, the court reversed itself. In a 5-4 decision, the new majority ruled that the Legal Tender Act was entirely constitutional, arguing that the federal government possessed implied powers necessary for national survival, including the power to issue fiat currency. Chief Justice Chase found himself in the agonizing position of writing the dissenting opinion. He argued passionately against the expanding power of the federal government, warning that allowing the state to manipulate the money supply without the anchor of gold would inevitably lead to inflation and the destruction of wealth. But he was outvoted. The system he had built in a moment of desperation had become too vast, too deeply embedded in the American economy to be dismantled. The machine he designed had outgrown its creator. Salmon P. Chase died in 1873, a man who had profoundly shaped the nation, but never achieved the presidency he felt he deserved. Yet his legacy is not defined by his political failures, but by the financial architecture he forced into existence. The federal power to issue standard currency, the authority to mandate its acceptance, the national banking system, and the vast internal revenue apparatus, these were all born from Chase's relentless drive to fund the Civil War. The portrait of Chase on the $1 bill was eventually replaced by George Washington in 1869, a subtle removal of the ambitious Treasury Secretary from the daily pockets of citizens. But the physical money was just a symbol. The true mechanism of power, the federal monopoly on currency, and the sprawling infrastructure of national finance remained entirely intact. Today, when you use a credit card, secure a mortgage, or pay your income tax, you are operating within the parameters of the system Salmon P. Chase built. He proved that the power to define money is the ultimate power of the state. He showed that in moments of existential crisis, the architecture of a nation can be fundamentally rewired by a single, determined individual willing to stretch the limits of authority. We live our lives surrounded by invisible systems, the tax codes, the banking regulations, the monetary policies that govern our choices and shape our futures. These systems are not natural laws. They were engineered by specific people, driven by specific ambitions, and forged in the fires of specific historical crises. Understanding how these mechanisms were built is the only way to understand how they currently operate and who they truly serve. When you pull out a dollar bill today, whose face do you think should be looking back at you? Those who led the country, or those who literally built the financial system that powers it? If you want to continue uncovering the hidden origins of the structures that dictate our modern world, subscribe to our channel. We investigate the architects of power, the laws that altered reality, and the deep historical mechanics behind the systems you interact with every single day.